Hello, my name is Nick Loesch, and today I'd like to talk about the economic implications of the recent government shutdown that lasted over a month and a half beginning on October 1st. The government shut down because the Senate and House of Representatives failed to agree on a budget. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party both proposed budgets, but neither of them were agreed upon, therefore putting the government in a shutdown. Furloughing employees, which had them working with no pay, while some essential workers continued to work with no pay and would get back pay. To go into detail further, I think it's first important to mention why this happened. Starting out with the main reason was like the ACA subsidies. The Affordable Care Act was passed under Obama, also known as Obamacare, which created a marketplace for health insurance, making it more affordable and accessible. There was subsidies that were added by President Joe Biden during his term during COVID that made healthcare cheaper for people in need during hard times. Those extended subsidies were set to run out at the end of this fiscal year, and the Democratic Party did not want that to happen, so they were fighting for that to be renewed for the coming years. Although the Republican Party did not agree with this, and they're looking to tackle the larger issue of the federal deficit, which now tops over 38 trillion, and that's something they're trying to focus on now, or they were just using it as a leveraging chip to prevent the subsidies from being enhanced. The program would still be there, but the enhanced subsidies would go away. This was kind of the main back and forth between the two parties that prevented the shutdown. Ultimately, now that the shutdown is over, the conclusion was that the subsidies were not extended, but both sides did agree that they would talk about the subsidies now that's reopened. This was kind of the deciding factor for the shutdown and the main cause for it, but the social and economic implications that came because of this were very drastic and affected many people on a personal level. I'd like to first start talking about the macro level, though, kind of on a broader scale. Goldman Sachs estimated that per week that the shutdown went on, which was about 6 weeks or 7 weeks, that the national GDP would drop by 0.15%. Some other reputable sources agreed with this, ranging from the drop between 0.1 to 0.2. EY estimated that the government currently employs 2.3 million employees, 800,000 of those which are considered non-essential. This means that they were not essential or needed for daily operations. This may have included people like the Department of Commerce or agriculture, maybe, but essential workers include people in national security and that kind of stuff. So the non-essential workers were furloughed, meaning they're going home, not working, and not being paid. So these people don't have paychecks coming in, so they're not getting money and they're not spending money, pumping it back into the economy. There was also the non-essential workers that were working during this time, but they're not getting paid. They would get back pay when the government reopened, which they did. With this, the furloughed employees, the 800,000, had an estimated salary of $106,000, and per week that these employees were furloughed, there was a lack of $1.7 billion that was generated by these employees that was not going into the economy. So this contributes to a larger 0.15 decrease in total GDP that Goldman Sachs referenced. Also, on the macro scale, there was a lack of labor statistics because the people that calculate statistics were not working. These statistics are very important for both public and private investors, and as well as the Federal Reserve, who decides interest rates. The Federal Reserve had two meetings, I believe, which they had the lack of the current job reports, which were very highly sought after the time. So they kind of had to make their decisions based on they had to make their decisions on the interest rate kind of blindly. Ultimately, they decided to drop it by 0.25% the first meeting and then keep it still the second meeting. But this could have been a big issue. Additionally, on a micro scale, kind of a smaller personal scale, there was a lot of employees that were going without paychecks. This puts their livelihood in jeopardy. They might not have been able to pay rent, afford food, but they definitely dropped their discretionary spending. Discretionary spending is kind of the after your necessities spending, kind of your wants. So this is eating out, entertainment, travel. These are really the things that pump a capitalistic society. So without all these employees, the $1.7 billion lack of money that's being pumped into the economy, that really took a big hit. Additionally, in local economies such as the DC area or military bases, where there's a high concentration of federally paid employees, the local businesses took a huge hit too. A lot of local shops, like coffee shops and food spots in DC, had to close down or cut costs by reducing staff um, or increasing their prices because they weren't getting the same type of foot traffic because their typical employees, which were the federal workers, were not getting paid and therefore spending. This can be represented on a supply demand curve with the downward shift because the demand is shifting down, um, and therefore the employees are having to drop their supply. So they're having their employees work less hours or even paying them less. So that even trickles down from just the federal employees are getting hit to local businesses and to their employees. Overall, there's a very large trickle down effect that happens when you stop paying a large amount of employees as the federal government did. When they're on pause, they're not spending the money, and that definitely trickles down to the local businesses. Additionally, SNAP was paused, which EBT or food stamps, and about 13% of the population, um, I believe, is on food stamps. And so that is a very significant amount of the population. Almost 1/8 of the population um, is on food stamps. And on November 1st, the food stamps that were supposed to go out then did not go out. And those people had to go without food or without food assistance. Eventually, things were passed and they had half the funding and then the full funding. But if the government shutdown had gone on for just a few more weeks longer, that could have been a huge issue. And it was. It was a big issue, even for the time it went on. Additionally, there's a lot of social implications that also tie into economic implications. First is tourism. Foreign tourists are much less likely to come to the United States when we're in a government shutdown. International travel or international tourists are not confident in the United States. If they're not in a government shutdown, is it safe to go there? They're really not sure. It leaves a lot of stuff up in the air, so that could prevent tourists. Also, the United States, like the visa department, having international tourists there, there's no one working and there's no one shut down. So that is really halting another aspect of the economy. Additionally to food stamps and the labor statistics, there's a lot of independent agencies. I mean, not independent agencies, I apologize, government agencies such as the FDA that are paused. And without these regulators working, this slows down, their checks and stuff like that. Really slows innovation and the production of new products and all that kind of stuff. So it's just another small factor that's also contributing to the government shutdown, just highlighting how many smaller aspects are being affected by this one larger issue. There's also a big decrease in the trust in government in the United States, a big issue that's going on right now, and it was only strengthened. And this can be shown through an economic standpoint with gold and silver hitting record high prices and that typically happens when people lose trust in government. They move their money from cash or their bank accounts to more accredited global currencies like gold and silver, which, like I mentioned, both hit record highs. And they dropped back down after the government was shut down, proving that this was because of the lack of trust and the uncertainty going forward. Looking back at the history of some shutdowns, in 2013 there was a 16-day shutdown that roughly cost the United States economy $24 billion in disruption. So our shutdown now was over 34 days was the previous longest that happened during Trump's first term. We broke that record out of the water by over 10 days. So this past one was now the longest, almost 3 times as long as the one that cost 24 billion. The numbers have not come out, I don't believe, on the total economic disruption, but I'm sure it was a lot. And this kind of raises the question to, is it worth it for politicians to use, our government livelihood, the livelihood of all the federal workers as a bargaining piece to argue for certain perks such as ACA subsidies? Some people believe it was worth it, and some do not. There's a lot of economic implications that were going on throughout the shutdown, a lot of layers, and like I mentioned, the trickle down effect from the employees to the local businesses to their employees. A lot of people are affected by this, and on both a macro and micro scale. I think this is a really important event and a good learning event for future experiences, and I thoroughly enjoyed looking into this more and presenting on this. Thank you.